I found a list of the top 100 best omnibuses as voted for by you, and today we're going to see how many do I own, and also just how many I've actually read. Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Now this video is only possible thanks to a Reddit post that I saw over on the Omnibus Collectors group that was done by Kenny-NY. So massive thanks to them. I'll leave a link in the description down below. Go give them some karma, throw some free awards at them, or if you've got some spare cash to spare, why not give them some platinum? Now the rules to this one are simple. To make it onto the list, there has to be at least 100 ratings from different users. So what that means is if you don't agree with one of the scores, or if one of your favourites hasn't made it onto here, it is absolutely in no way my fault. But let's get a tally started and jump into this, because kicking it off in 100th place with an average score of 4.20 is the New Avengers Omnibus Volume 1, and I'd be interested to see where Volume 2 would land on this list, if Marvel would ever make it. I have read this entire series, but when it comes to owning it, I'm going to be very strict. If I've got it in a different format or anything other than the Omnibus, it's not going to count. And unfortunately, because I didn't want to just stop with half the series, I only have this in the oversized hardcovers. Oh boo-hoo, I actually get to finish the series. We've then got a four-way tie for 96th place, with all of these having an average score of 4.21. And first up is Howard the Duck, and I'm assuming this is the original run from the 80s and not the one that was done by Chip Zdarsky. Unfortunately, I don't own this and I haven't read it. Joining it is the Invincible Iron Man Volume 1. Again, I'm assuming this is a Silver Age title and not the series that was done by Matt Fraction, but again, another one that I don't own and I haven't read. Another Silver Age title that I feel a lot of people would disagree with it being in this place is the Uncanny X-Men Volume 4. This is one of the only Silver Age series that I've got in my collection, but unfortunately I haven't read this specific volume. And admittedly, I was half tempted to sell these off, because if I ever did get around to reading this series, I'd probably go for it digitally. Yep, I know I'm throwing in a controversial opinion early. And the last book in 96th place is Star Wars by Jason Aaron. Now this is one that I have read and I do own, and I do think it's a fantastic series, and I'm probably going to go back to it in the future. Another four-way tie for 92nd place, and all of these had a score of 4.22, so it is literally a slight point between them, but starting it off is Spider-Man by Roger Stern. Now I have read quite a few issues out of this run, but I don't think I've read the full thing, so I am going to be strict and say that I haven't read it, but I do own it. Also joining it is the Fantastic Four Volume 1, which again I'm going to assume is a Silver Age run, and I did own the first printing of this, and I read through the entire thing, but I then later did sell it when I needed driving lessons. Then you've got Annihilation Conquest, which is a book that I do own, but I haven't read just yet. And admittedly, I'm a bit annoyed because it doesn't look like the original Annihilations on this list, which is a book that I read and was actually one of the first reviews that I did on this channel. But I can only count the books that I've got in front of me, and rounding out this 92nd place is Infinite Crisis, which is an omnibus that I do own, and I'm probably going to break my own rule here because I've read the main event quite a few times, and I'm even going to be doing it again for this year's season of events. So it's not like the world's going to end because I do this, but I'm going to include it in both my read column and my own column. Oh, also a rule that I forgot to mention at the beginning, these ratings are accurate to when this list was published about 2 months ago, because I am really not on top of my schedule with this channel. You've then got a two-way tie for 90th place, both of these coming in with a score of 4.23, and first up is Justice League International Volume 1. I do own this, and I have read the bulk of it, but I haven't read the full thing. I just love me some Booster Gold, what can I say? And also joining it is Grant Morrison's New X-Men. This is a series that I read years ago when I was way too young to understand what was really going on, and I do currently own the Omnibus, but this is a title that you might see a review for in the coming months. A three-way tie for 87th place, all of these coming in with a score of 4.24, and the first one is Wonder Woman by George Perez Volume 1. Now if I'm being strict, I have only read the Gods and Mortals part of this story, and also the War of the Gods, which I really enjoyed talking about when I did my George Perez top 5 notable works, but realistically that's only about 8 issues of this first volume, so I'm not going to include it in my read column, but I am going to include it in the owned. You've also got Mark Millar's The Ultimates, which was such a fundamental series for me when I was first getting into comics. Some people still want to crucify anybody who's got a positive word to say about this universe, but I am proud to say that I'm an ultimate Marvel apologist. I own this book and I have read it. And last up in 87th place, it's Mark Millar again, because it's his Wolverine run. I know for certain I've read Old Man Logan, and I do believe that I've also read Enemy of the State, and I think that's pretty much everything that's in this omnibus, but I didn't actually read it in this format. However, it still counts and I do own it, so it's going in both columns. 86th place with a score of 4.25, it's X-Men Legacy Legion. Now there are just way too many X-Men omnibuses for me to own absolutely every single one of them. I'm kinda broke at the minute. And this is one that just completely fell under my radar. I don't even know much about it. I didn't watch the TV show either, so it's a 0 in both columns. 85th place, 1 point higher with a score of 4.26, it's John Carter Warlord of Mars. I probably would have read this if the movie did absolutely anything for me. Actually, I think I remember sort of enjoying the film, but I went on a date with somebody that it just didn't work out with. We really had an awful time, mostly because of the fact that, well, I'm me. And I think because it went so badly, I mostly just blame the film. 84th place with a score of 4.27 is the Oz Omnibus, which yep, is quite difficult for me to say with a bit of a lisp. I do own this and I have read the first 2 story arcs in this, but rules are rules even if I keep breaking them repeatedly, so it's only going to go in the owned column. A 3-way tie for 81st place with a score of 4.28. Kicking it off is Batman Nightfall Volume 1. Now Nightfall is something that I can proudly say I have read the entirety of. Admittedly it was in those really fat trade paperbacks and I was about 15 at the time. I was just really trying to get prepared for The Dark Knight Rises, so I am going to count that one, so it's going to go in both columns. Also you've got Daredevil by the man himself, Mark fucking Waid. It is volume 2 that's made it into this position, and admittedly I do feel like the first volume is a superior one. They're both great though, don't get me wrong, but this was something that I read in single issues, so it is going in both columns, but admittedly I think I could do with revisiting this. And rounding it out, you've got Batman by Paul Dini. Now I have read a story or 2 out of this, but I read it in a separate collection, and I don't think I've read 50% of this omnibus, so I do own it, but I'm not going to say that I've read it. A 2-way tie for 79th place, both of these with a score of 4.29, which before I even announce the titles, isn't it mad that everything on this list has a score that's higher than 4? I think that means that both companies have printed some really high quality omnibuses. In terms of the content, we all know that sometimes the binding and the page quality just isn't really there. But first up is the second volume of Batman's Grant Morrison run. Batman run. I'm fairly confident in saying that I have read everything in this, even though it was a bit of a mess when this was being printed in trade paperback. It's the 3rd volume where it gets a bit questionable with how much I've read, so I'm going to be a bit dodgy and include it in both columns. You've also got Ecstatics, which when this was first printed, I didn't realise I was going to be as much of a fan of Michael Wood's style, so I do wish I would have picked this up and given it a chance, but admittedly, I don't really know too much about it, so it's a big old 0 in both columns. In 78th place with a score of 4.30 is the New Teen Titans Volume 1. Now I bought this series when it was originally printed in omnibuses when the spines were white, and for some reason they just stopped at Volume 3 and then did it again. But I read all 3 of those many years ago, so I'm confident in saying that I've read everything that's included in the new printing of Volume 1, and because I wanted to finish this out, I've also got the new printings. A 2-way tie for 76th place, both of these with a score of 4.31. Starting it off is The Death of Captain America. Yeah, spoilers if you didn't know since 2007. I got the original printing of this, and I remember reading it the day they got delivered, so it's gonna go in both. Also, you've got Guardians of the Galaxy by Abnett and Lanning. Now this is a grey area because I have read all of this because I was such a massive fan of Nova, but I know I've got Annihilation Conquest and also the 3 volumes of War of Kings, which does collect this full run, so I do technically have this in omnibus format, but I don't have the omnibus that's dedicated to it. So I'm going to err on the side of caution because this is the absolute last thing that I'd want to be cancelled for, and I'm going to include it in the red column, but not the owned one. We then got a 5-way tie for 71st place, all of these with a score of 4.32, and starting it off is Star Wars Dr. Aphra Volume 1. I've read part of this because a lot of it does cross over with Kieran Gillen's Darth Vader run, and I do own the omnibus, but I'm not going to say that I've read it all. I'm probably going to wait until that 2nd volume comes out, which I believe is due soon, and you can already order it with the discount codes that we've got from the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOFWOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOF, ship it together for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below, and you can use these codes as many times as you like. Still in 71st place, we've got Ultimate Comics, The Death of Spider-Man. I have read all of this, but I still only own the trade paperbacks because they haven't reprinted this yet, and this is something that I even own the single issues of, and then I sold it again when I needed driving lessons, and I don't think I'm ever going to forgive myself for selling my copy of Ultimate Fallout issue 4 as part of the bundle. Yep, really could do with that money right now. But yeah, I've read it, but I don't own the omnibus. Also joining this group, and I think it's criminally low on this list, but it's Y: The Last Man. Again, this is based on group ratings, so I don't know why it's so low. Maybe people don't like it as much as I did, but this is one of my favourite series of all time, and I'm glad to say that I don't own the omnibuses, because I've got the absolute editions, and I've read this countless times, so even though it can only enter one column, I'm glad that it's doing so. You've also got Young Avengers. I don't know if this is a Kieran Gillen run or the Alan Heinberg one. Either way, I own both of them and I've read both of them, but I definitely think Heinberg's better than Gillen. And rounding out 71st place is Batman by Grant Morrison Volume 1. Again, I know I've read everything in this, and I also own this. A 3-way tie for 68th place, all of these with a score of 4.33, but first up is going to be the New Teen Titans Volume 2. And if this is the one with the Judas contract, I definitely agree with this being higher than Volume 1, so I have read it and I do own it. You've also got Wonder Woman by Brian Azzarello and Cliff Chang. I've read this when it was coming out in single issues, and I'm glad to say that I own the omnibus. Joining them is The Amazing Spider-Man by J. Michael Straczynski Volume 1. I own this book. I remember pre-ordering the first printing of it because I didn't want to miss out, and I've still only read the first 10 or so issues of this, so I'm going to be fair and only include this in the owned column. Another 3-way tie, this time for 65th place, all of these with a a score of 4.34. First up is Daredevil by Ed Brubaker Volume 2. If I'm remembering correctly, this is the one that had all of the stuff with the Return of Kingpin, which was great, but I much prefer the stuff that Brubaker did when he started out this series. Admittedly though, if this was a list of my personal top 10 favourite omnibuses, it'd pretty much just all be Daredevil. By the way, I've got the first printing of this and I have read it. You've also got Punisher Max by Jason Aaron, a title that I do own and I think was the last book that I read before I started this channel. Joining them is Hellblazer by Garth Ennis. Now I have read a good chunk of this digitally, but I don't think I've read everything that Ennis did and I don't own this. Mostly because I'm hoping DC just prints a Hellblazer line of omnibuses. Come on, I can't be alone in that one. In 64th place with a score of 4.35 is the Super Sons Omnibus. It doesn't mention if this is the original or the expanded or the new printing of the expanded edition, but I did have the first printing of this and then I sold it because I wanted the expanded edition. So if it is the original printing, yes, I've read everything that's in that, but not necessarily the expanded version. But you know what, I've been quite fair on a few occasions, so I'm going to include it in the red pile, but I don't currently own this. With a score of 4.36, in 63rd place is Daredevil by Mark Waid Volume 1. Like I said, I did feel like this was better out of the gates than it was at the end, so I agree with this being higher than Volume 2, and I do currently own it, so it's going to go in both columns. A two-way tie for 61st place, both of these with a score of 4.38. You've got Batman and Robin by Peter J. Tomasi and Patrick Gleason, which I have read, I've even done a review of it on this channel, and I do still own the omnibus. I don't know about anybody else, but is the word omnibus starting to sound like it's not a real word anymore? And you've also got Star Wars Darth Vader, and I haven't read the rest of the list, I wanted it to be a bit of a surprise, so I can't tell if this is the Charles Soule run or the Kieran Gillen one. If it's a Kieran Gillen run, it's way too low on this list, and I don't think that Soule's even going to appear on this, because Gillen's run was just far superior. Either way, I've read both of those books, so I can confidently put it in both columns. You've then got a six-way tie for 55th place, all of these with a score of 4.39. First up is Jack Kirby's Commandy. Now there's not too many Jack Kirby-centric omnibuses that I've bought, and this definitely isn't one of them. It's just never really been on my radar, so it's going to be a blank in both columns. You've also got the Superior Foes of Spider-Man, which was a really skinny omnibus, so I just felt like I was being ripped off. But then I saw the prices that it's going for now, and I think people are really getting ripped off. But again, a blank in both columns. You've also got the Uncanny X-Men Volume 1, which I'm feeling pretty confident in saying that I've read the majority of this, because I know the Dark Phoenix saga was in the second volume, and I know I've read well past that, and I currently own it. Like I said, not sure if I'm going to sell it, so it's going to be a 1 in both columns. Also, we've got a very whammy boy because it's The Invisibles by Grant Morrison. I do own this, and I believe I read the first volume of it, but I haven't read the full thing. And joining it is another whammy boy, but it's Blackest Night. I know I've read a significant amount of this because there's so much overlap with the Jeff Johns Green Lantern omnibuses, but I don't own this specific volume because there was just so much double dipping. And we started this position with Jack Kirby, and we're going to end it with him because it's Fourth World. I know I read a bit of this when I was first getting into comics, but I was just way too young to really understand what was happening, and I know I definitely didn't read the full thing, so I do own the omnibus, but I'm not going to say that I've read it. You've then got a two-way tie for 53rd place, both of these with a score of 4.40, both of them about the same character, and both done by the same writer, because the first one is Punisher Max by Garth Ennis Volume 2. Now I own this one, and I know I've read all of Volume 1, but I don't think that I've finished out this series. But the other one, I've already done a review for on this channel, because it's the Punisher Marvel Knight by Garth Ennis. I'm glad that these two are in the same position, so that there's no fighting between the runs, unless Volume 1's higher, but I absolutely love this run, and I still own it to this day, so it's going to go in both. You've then got a six-way tie for 47th place, all of these with a score of 4.41, and first up is Tom Taylor's The All New Wolverine. I reviewed this last year on the channel, and I got the DM variant of this because I thought it was a far superior cover, and I really enjoyed it even if I did feel like there was a couple of flaws, so it is going to go in both columns. You've also got The Avengers by Jonathan Hickman Volume 1. I thought this was going to be much higher. I loved this run when I read it in single issues, and I do still own the omnibuses, and I'm planning on revisiting this later this year. You've also got American Vampire Volume 1, another series that I read in single issues before I knew that Scott Snyder was going to be such a big name in comics. I do still need to read the end of this run, but I know that I've read everything that's in that first volume, so it's going to go in both columns. You've also got Fantastic Four by John Byrne Volume 1. I've got the original printing of it right here, and I know I've read both of these volumes cover to cover. Yeah, I used to have a lot more free time. You've also got Daredevil by Ed Brubaker Volume 1. Like I said, I do think this is the better of the two, and I'm glad that I've still got it in my collection. And rounding out this place, you've got Loki Journey into Mystery by Kieran Gillen. I own this omnibus, and I think I've read the first couple of issues, but I know I haven't read the full thing. You've then got a three-way tie for 44th place, all of these with a score of 4.42. There was a lot of fours right there. And admittedly, I feel like these three would be much higher if this was my own personal list, but kicking it off, we've got Alias. I absolutely love this run. I've still got my complete collections of it, even though I upgraded, and it's definitely one of my favourites. You've also got the first volume of Captain America by Ed Brubaker, another one that I had to buy the new printing of because I love the DM variant so much, but this was one of the very first omnibuses that I ever owned, so it's definitely going to go in both columns. And I've also got a video about this series coming out soon. And rounding it out, we've also got Aquaman by Jeff Johns. Phenomenal run, great omnibus. I love when I reviewed this early on when I was doing this channel, and I still own it to this day. I can see it from where I'm sitting here. I'm going to wave at it for you, but I'm glad to say that it's going in both columns. In 43rd place with a score of 4.43, you've got Daredevil by Frank Miller and Klaus Janson. I read all of this. I remember this was one of the very first omnibuses that I ever saw got reprinted, and I've still got it in my collection. I'd love to go back to this run and do a video on it. But long story short, both columns. You've then got a three-way tie for 40th place, all of these with a score of 4.45, and the first one's kind of ironic because it's the Daredevil by Frank Miller companion omnibus. Yeah, this does have the Man Without Fear, which definitely was the best thing that he wrote for this character, except for maybe the Elektra stuff. So what am I talking about? It's all great. But it's going to be another tick in both columns. You've also got Stephen King's The Stand, which, if we're going to get pedantic about it, technically shouldn't be on this list because it's no longer owned by Marvel, but don't really want to be one of those people. I've read the actual novel of this, but unfortunately that doesn't count, and I don't own this because it went stupidly out of print, so it's going to be a 0 in both columns. And rounding out 40th place is The Sleeper by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips. And I am very pleased to say that thanks to that reprint, I finally own this. And this was one of the very first titles that I read for this creative team, and if I'm being completely honest, I didn't enjoy this at first. Fortunately though, with the benefit of hindsight and having matured, I went back to it, and this is one of my favourite titles, and personally, I probably would have put it a bit higher in the list. In 39th place with a score of 4.46, you've got The Uncanny X-Force by Rick Remender. I own this omnibus, thankfully, since it went stupidly out of print, and I think I've read about 15 to 20 issues of this, but I know I haven't read the ending. So again, I'm going to err on the side of caution, and it's only going to be a tick in the owned column. You've then got a four-way tie for 35th place, all of these with a score of 4.47, and first up is another Stephen King adaptation because it's The Dark Tower. Similar to The Stand, I've read the vast majority of the novels for this series, but I don't own the omnibus and I can't say I've read the comic. You've also got the Fantastic Four Volume 2, and I know I read this because I had the original printing and I really wanted to read all of the Galactus stuff, but again, your boy needed driving lessons. You've also got Planetary, which I do own the omnibus of and not the Absolute Edition, which kind of works out well for this video, and I read this years and years ago and I remember really enjoying it, but I know that it's probably about time that I revisit it. And rounding it out, you've got Ms. Marvel Volume 1. I'm assuming this is a Kamala Khan stuff, and I still don't know why they never did a Volume 2 with this, and it's because of that I never picked up this first volume and instead chased after the oversized hardcovers, and I know for definite I read at least 3 of them, which I'm assuming is going to be more than half of this series. A three-way tie for 32nd place, all with a score of 4.48, and starting it off is The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1. Again, I'm assuming this is a Silver Age stuff, which I did have the first printing of the omnibus for, and I read all of it, even if it wasn't the easiest task, but I then later did sell it because it took up pretty much half of a bookshelf, so I can only say that I've read this one. Then you've got Doom Patrol by Grant Morrison, which I know I've read a significant amount of, and I do own the omnibus, but I can't say I've read it all. And rounding it out is one of my personal favourites, which is the reason why I gave the omnibus format a second chance, because it's The Astonishing X-Men by Joss Whedon and John Cassaday. I recently reread this and it's still one of my absolute favourites. It'd probably make it into my own personal top 10, but again, this is a public vote, so I just have to accept where it is. Yet this is going to be one of those books that's probably never going to leave my collection, and I'm glad to say that it's going in both columns. You've then got a 7-way tie for 25th place, all of these coming in with a score of 4.49. And the first one has got me confused because it's Star Wars Darth Vader by Charles Soule. Now again, I know this is a majority vote, so that means that I'm in the minority, but considering that this is out of 5, that's pretty much the equivalent of 90%. And it's also beaten titles like The Astonishing X-Men, and Daredevil by Ed Brubaker, and Daredevil by Mark Waid, and Planetary, and countless other titles that this series is nowhere near to. Again, like I said, maybe I'm just completely in the minority. I also think there might be some kind of recency bias going on here, but to me this isn't even the best Darth Vader omnibus, let alone one of the best Star Wars omnibuses that's ever been printed. Either way though, I did a review of this last year, so it is going to go in both columns, and the DM variant's still beautiful. Something that is apparently on the same level as Charles Soule's run on Darth Vader is The Ultimate Spider-Man Volume 1. I've made it no secret on this channel, I think this series is just the best. It'd probably be in my own personal top 5, and I've even double dipped on this, so it's definitely going to make it into both columns. Another one that, just to remind you, is apparently on the same caliber as Charles Soule's run on Darth Vader is Green Lantern by Jeff Johns Volume 3. Another series that I've made it no secret that I think is just the best, but I've read this, I loved every single issue of it, and I'm still glad that it's in my collection. I'm going to stop hating on Soule's Darth Vader run for a little bit, but just remember that everything that's in 25th place is apparently as good as that title, and that's including Animal Man by Grant Morrison. I read this when it was in 3 thick trade paperbacks, and I absolutely loved this series, and I was happy to upgrade to the omnibus when I found it on some kind of market marketplace. You've also got Avengers by Jonathan Hickman Volume 2, which admittedly I feel should have included Secret Wars, but personally I think I enjoyed Volume 1 a little bit more, but we'll see if that's the same when I go back and revisit it, but still I own it and I read it in single issues. You've also got Miles Morales The Ultimate Spider-Man, which was a title that was picking up in singles, and I own the second printing of it. I know it's been re-released as a Volume 1 and a Volume 2, but I've got the originals of those, so I definitely think it ticks both columns. And starting off the last quarter of this list, we've got The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 2. Now I don't believe I ever owned this omnibus, and I've only really read a handful of stories from it, so I know I've read stuff like The Night That Gwen Stacy Died, but I think the majority of this omnibus is something that I haven't read, so it's going to be a 0 in both columns. In 24th place with a score of 4.50 is The Mighty Thor. I'm assuming this is a Silver Age stuff, even though it doesn't say Volume 1, but I've never read this and I don't own it. In 23rd place with a score of 4.51 is Hawkeye by Matt Fraction. I'm not sure if I just read this in the wrong mood, but I really didn't enjoy this my first time round. I do still own the omnibus because I want to come back to it someday, but personally I feel like Matt Fraction's work on Iron Fist was much more enjoyable than Hawkeye, but we'll see if that opinion holds up later. No idea why my camera decided to just not film these next three, so I'm just going to do a quick voiceover because there's a three-way tie for 20th place, all of them with a score of 4.52. And first up is Green Lantern by Jeff Johns Volume 1, and I wouldn't exactly have Volume 2 or 3 on my shelf and not have the first one, so I'm glad to say that I've read this and I also own it. Joining it, you've also got Fantastic Four by Jonathan Hickman Volume 1. I love this run and I'm planning on coming back to it soon. I want to do like a Jonathan Hickman year of reads, and I actually think this was the better part of his run, so I'm glad to say that I own this and I have read it. And rounding out 20th place, you've also got The Uncanny X-Men Volume 2. Now I know I've read at least the Dark Phoenix saga and a lot of the issues that surround this, and I do currently own it despite what I might do in future, so I'm going to be generous to myself because it's been a very long time editing this video and I'm going to put it in both columns. You've then got a two-way tie for 18th place, all of these with a score of 4.53. You've got The Punisher Max by Garth Ennis Volume 1, which to me says that this must be the best of everything that he's done. I still think that Welcome Back Frank is the absolute pinnacle of what he did, but I know that I've read this omnibus and I still own it. You've got Conan the Barbarian, the original Marvel Years Volume 1, which I've read the first handful of issues of and I do currently own. A two-way tie for 16th place, both with a score of 4.56. And first up is JSA by Jeff Johns Volume 2. I've only read this in the original trade paperbacks and I don't know if that contained the full series, but I know that I've read the vast majority of this and I do own the omnibuses, so I'm going to be a bit cheeky and put it in both columns. And you've also got The Uncanny X-Men Volume 3. I think this includes the Days of Future Past stuff, or at bare minimum it's got the Wolverine in Japan arc. I'm not really too sure, it gets a bit muddled for me when it comes to this run, but I'm going to err on the side of caution and just say that I haven't read it, but I do currently own it. And fun fact, this also seems to be the highest rated Uncanny X-Men omnibus. But in 15th place with a score of 4.57 is The Fantastic Four by Jonathan Hickman Volume 2. Now I read this years and years ago, and if I'm remembering correctly, I really didn't think that the second volume was better than the first. I just really didn't like a lot of the FF stuff. But I am due to go back and check this out again. It was pretty much when this first got printed that I read it, but still that means that it's one that's joining the red column and also the owned column. Just beating it with a score of 4.58, in 14th place is Lucifer Volume 2. Now Lucifer is one of those series that I own both of the omnibuses for, but I've only read I think 2 trade paperbacks worth of it. I remember enjoying it and I remember saying to myself, one day I'm going to go back to this and I'll probably really enjoy it, but unfortunately that day has not yet happened, so I can only include it in the owned column. And beating it just slightly with a score of 4.59, we've got a two-way tie for 12th place, and first up is Lucifer Volume 1. So when I do read these, I'll be making sure to check if I feel like the first volume is 1 point higher than the second. But again, I own it, but I can't confidently say that I've read it all. And actually, because I'm apparently really bad at counting, it's a 4-way tie for 10th place instead of a 2-way tie for 12th place. So you've also got Batman by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale here, which was the first book that I ever reviewed on this channel, so I can definitely say that I've read it and I also own this. You've also got Batman by Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo Volume 1. I read this when it was coming out in single issues because, as you guys should all know by now, the New 52 is my jam, and I own the omnibuses, so it's going in both columns. And the last one before we jump into single figures is Thor by Jason Aaron Volume 1. I also think this might be the most recent omnibus that's made it onto this list, but again, this is another one that I read in single issues. I haven't read the end of the run, but I do believe that I've read everything that's contained in the first volume. Then we've got a two-way tie for 8th place with a score of 4.60, and first up is Injustice Gods Among Us Volume 1. It always amazes me just how good this series is, considering that it's based off a game, because spoiler alert, I don't think the Batman Arkham saga Saga Omnibus is going to make it on here. But I know I've read the first 2 years worth of this series. I haven't read the end of it just yet, but I do own this and I'm going to say that I've read it. And also joining it is one of my favourite omnibuses of all time. I'd definitely be putting this higher in my own personal list because it's Daredevil by Brian Michael Bendis Volume 1. This is one of my favourite runs of all time. I've owned it in multiple different formats, but currently the way that I've got it is the omnibus. So it's going to go in both columns. We've then got a 3-way tie for 5th place, all of these with a score of 4.61. And first up is Daredevil by Brian Michael Bendis Volume 2. Now admittedly I can't remember where Volume 1 cuts off and Volume 2 starts, but I do remember enjoying Volume 1 much more. But again, it's a group consensus, so I'm just going to go with it. You've also got Green Lantern by Jeff Johns Volume 2, which I would definitely agree is the best volume in this saga, so I'm glad to say that this is going in both columns. And we've also got Silver Surfer by Dan Slott and Mike Allred. This was one of my biggest whales for a long amount of time. It recently got a reprint, but unfortunately I just haven't had the funds yet to pick it up. I read the first couple of issues, but I know I haven't finished it all, so unfortunately it's not going to make it into either column, but hopefully later this year it will. And there are no ties in the top 4 because kicking it off in 4th place with a score of 4.62 is the Sandman Omnibus Volume 3. Now I thought this was all pretty much just supplementary series, so I'm surprised that this is as high as it is. But if you've been watching this channel for a significant amount of time, I famously have not read Sandman. It's just too daunting and intimidating, and there's so much hype around it that I worry that I wouldn't enjoy it as much as everybody else does. And normally that kind of thing doesn't bother me when it comes to comics, but with Sandman it seems like this untouchable thing. And edging it out just slightly and getting the bronze medal with a score of 4.63 is gonna be the Gotham Central Omnibus. This is something that I've already read in the past. I had those 4 single hardcovers, and then I did recently pick up the reprint of the omnibus. And I'm also reading this again currently, so it's definitely going to be a tick in both columns. Now there are some honourable mentions, but none of these had 100 ratings just yet, so the average might be slightly higher, but at the same time if it did get 100 ratings it'd probably still be in this top 100, if that makes any sense. I'm not really great at explaining things. But with a score of 4.65, you've got The Question by Dennis O'Neil Omnibus Volume 1. I'm very excited to see that Volume 2 has been announced. When that finally does arrive, I'm going to read both of these. But at the moment, I can only say that I own this. You've also got Miracle Man with a score of 4.60. I think I've read 2 issues of this way back in the day, but I do currently own the omnibus. With a score of 4.50, you've got Green Arrow by Mike Grell Volume 1. And I think I've read the Longbow Hunters part of this, but I can't say that I've read it all, but I do currently own both volumes. You've also got Legion of Superheroes 5 Years Later Volume 1 with a score of 4.55. And I do own this, but admittedly I was really excited to get this, but then as soon as it got delivered, my hype just died. With a score of 4.47, you've got The Savage Sword of Conan, the original Marvel Years Omnibus Volume 1. This was the first ever birthday present that Shadowcat got for me, and I did read this start to finish, so it's going to make it into both columns. With a score of 4.44, you've also got The Savage Sword of Conan Volume 2. I read the start of this, but I didn't continue it. Not that it was bad or anything, it's just that it is very dense, and I have to be in the right mood to read this, but I still own it, so it's going to make it into that column. You've also got JSA by Jeff Johns Volume 3. That's making it into the honourable mentions with a score of 4.43. And like I said, I know I read a lot of this series, but I don't think I've read the conclusion, but I still own it, so at least it'd make it into that column. With a score of 4.37, you've also got Conan the Barbarian, the original Marvel Years Volume 2, but I do own that one, but I never really started the original comics. More of a Savage Sword kind of guy. With a score of 4.34, you've got Tomb of Dracula Volume 2. The reason why this probably doesn't have 100 ratings is because nobody could get their hands on it, but this is one that never really appealed to me, even though I am quite a big Blade fan, so it wouldn't make it into either column. With a score of 4.29, you've got X-Men The Dark Phoenix Saga. I never picked this up because I thought the majority of this was contained in the Uncanny X-Men volumes, and I know I've read the main Dark Phoenix story and a lot of storylines that do involve it, but I can't confidently say that I know what's contained in here, and even if I've read it all. With a score of 4.24, you've also got Shang-Chi Master of Kung Fu Volume 2. I own it, but there's a lot of content there, so I can't say that I've jumped into it just yet. And rounding out the honourable mentions with the same score of 4.24 is Marvel Knights by Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale, yellow, blue, white, and grey. I always struggle to remember all 4. Now I have read all 4 of these stories, but I've got the original printing of this where it didn't include Captain America White. So unfortunately, because I'm 25% off, I'm not going to say that I've read all of this. Now I feel like the top 2 is going to be very anticlimactic, especially considering what was in 4th place. But in 2nd place with an average score of 4.65 is the Sandman Omnibus Volume 1. Yeah, I'm not surprised that this is making it as high as it is on the list. It's Sandman, everybody seems to love it, and I do still own these omnibuses, even if I haven't read them yet. And I am just realising that I said that I haven't got Volume 3, but I do. Sorry, I didn't mean to lie to you. Hopefully one day you can trust me again. And in what should be a surprise to absolutely nobody, in 1st place with a massively high score of 4.72, is the Sandman Omnibus Volume 2. That to me is a pretty good sign that this series must start off really strong and just get better the longer that it goes on. And I don't know, I was always thinking to myself, maybe Sandman should be the last ever review that I do on this channel, because then if I don't give it 100%, I can at least leave the channel and don't have to deal with all the backlash. Yeah, I'm not afraid of taking the coward's way out. But still, this is another one that's going to make it into their own column, but unfortunately at this time I can't say that I've read it. But now that all the titles have been revealed, it's time for me to total up all the numbers and to see exactly how many I own and also how many I've read. And I'm going to leave it to the voiceover because I've definitely been counting as I'm going along, and I'm not going to do this whilst I'm editing, so you know, let me know what my total numbers are. You're shit at counting, but here it says that you've read 66 and you own 79. Wow, they are definitely two numbers between 0 and 100. But there are definitely some glaring omissions that I would have included. I would have had stuff like Batman No Man's Land, Planet Hulk, Fantastic Four by Mark Waid, JLA by Grant Morrison, Batwoman by Greg Rucka, probably at least one of the volumes of War of Kings. But anyway, I'm not going to disagree with the list because there's still some great titles on here, and in the comment section below let me know how many you've read and also how many you own. And don't try and shame anybody if they haven't read everything, because a lot of these books are expensive. But that's the video, and hopefully you enjoyed it, and until next time, just make sure that you stay safe and stay mad, all you dogs. Woof woof. See you at the next video.